Well, thanks very much for inviting me to this, Georgina. I'm particularly pleased because of Menzie's personal library being at the centre of this, of this institute. When I was researching my book on Robert Menzie's Forgotten People, which David forgot to mention, it was published in 1992 before Alan Martin's book. And one of the contributions I think it made was that for the first time it published the Forgotten People speech in full at the beginning. I'd found the speech in the archives when I was looking for something to give a class to read that would help them understand why Menzies was so powerful, and started thinking about it. Now, when I was doing that research, I spent some very fruitful hours browsing in Menzies' library. And as was a habit of many people of Menzies' days, Menzies would often underline passages in books he was reading in pencil. I used his underlinings in a copy of Shakespeare's play on Macbeth, for insight into the role of Lady Macbeth and female ambition in his political imagination. But the greatest find was a scrap of newspaper that fell out of his pocket edition of Edmund Burke. It was dated the 18th of December, 1942, when he was on the back bench and in the middle of the radio broadcasts to the forgotten people. And he was thinking about how to make non-Labor into a viable political force. Now, Burke's discussion of the purpose of political parties in his thoughts on the present discontent was heavily marked, as including the very famous definition of party of Burke's, that it's a body of men united on some principle to work for the interests of the national interest. I can't quite remember the words, but it supports David's argument about the way he wanted a political party. He saw the importance of that being founded on principle. And he also underlined Burke's advice to public men on how to live a good life. So here was first-hand evidence of Menzies in 1942 looking to earlier thinkers for guidance. So what I want to do today is to explore the influence on Menzies of another earlier political figure, Alfred Deakin, and the moderate liberal tradition of Deaconite liberalism, which carries Deakin's name. Menzies regarded Deakin as Australia's greatest Prime Minister. He called him the great constructor, who created Australia's basic national policies of irrigation, immigration, defence and tariff policy, the High Court and the Commonwealth Court of Conciliation and Arbitration. And in the mid-1940s, he argued, against other options, that the new non-Labor party should be called the Liberal Party, as was the first united federal non-Labor party, which Deakin led in 1909. So what is Deaconite liberalism? It refers to the policies and the philosophy of one of the two non-Labor parties that came together in 1909 at fusion to form the first joint non-Labor party. These two parties were the Victorian-based Liberal Party, led by Alfred Deakin, and the New South Wales-based, then anti-socialist party, led by George Reid. This party had earlier been called the Free Trade Party and was the Deaconite Liberals' major opponent during the debates over federation and for the first half of the first decade of the 20th century. The main point of difference between the two parties was trade. Deaconite Liberals were protectionists, Reid's party supported free trade. And just to answer the question that Tim Lindsay raised earlier about conservatism and liberalism in Australia and how those terms are used, basically all Australians are liberals in the sense that they're against entrenched privilege, inherited privilege. They're for the basic democratic rights. The country didn't have an established church. It didn't have an aristocracy. It didn't have a widely established military in the same way. So the social supports of English conservatism weren't here. So George Reid, who Deakin would call a conservative, was also a liberal. So it's quite confusing. But to go back to the differences between Deakin and Reid, the differences over trade had their roots in the different economic histories of the two colonies. Free trade was a core belief of British Liberals. It was forged in the campaign against the Corn Laws during Britain's hungry 40s. But in Victoria, after the gold rushes, many Liberals abandoned free trade in support of protection. Jobs were needed for the gold rush immigrants. Victoria's population had swelled sevenfold in less than a decade, and protected manufacturing was the answer, along with land reform. So Victorian Liberals argued that circumstances here in the colonies were different from in Britain, and the protection was justified so that infant industries could grow and the colony develop. New South Wales, by contrast, didn't face the same unemployment crisis, and it had a more developed and export-oriented pastoral economy. So New South Wales Liberals remained wedded to free trade. Now, Victoria's gold rush immigrants of the 1850s shaped the political culture of the new colony, which had just separated from New South Wales. They were mostly young and literate, with a high proportion of skilled artisans. Their policies were influenced by Chartism, the working class political movement which demanded democratic reform of Britain's class-based political institutions. In Victoria, the catalyst for this reform was Eureka. But by 1860, most of the Chartists' political demands had been achieved. There were no property qualifications, and there was manhood suffrage for elections to the lower house. There was secret ballot and regular electoral redistributions. And in 1870, Victoria became the first of the Australian colonies to grant the fifth of the Chartists' demands, which was payment of members of parliament. Now, both of Menzies' grandfathers were gold rush immigrants. And I think just to pick up on something that Troy said, he said to understand Menzies, you need to understand Jeparit. I think you actually need to understand Ballarat, because Jeparit is basically an offshoot of Ballarat. It's where both his parents grew up. And Troy mentioned his mother's father, the Cornish miner, John Sampson. John Sampson, when Menzies describes himself as a conservative when he's arguing with his grandfather, I took that to mean that he opposed the arguments for union preference and much of the arguments about trade unions that would have been coming from the Labor press that he was reading. John Sampson was, Menzies remembers, keenly political, though not rigidly partisan. A great one for Alfred Deakin, who was the federal member for Ballarat until Deakin retired in 1913. Keenly political, though not rigidly partisan. Menzies' description of his grandfather, Sampson, could as well describe the politics of Alfred Deakin as he managed the unstable parliament of the first decade. For the first 10 years of the new Commonwealth, no party had a majority, the reason being the spectacular electoral rise of the Federal Labor Party. At the end of the 19th century, when the Constitution was being shaped, the major lines of political difference were between New South Wales free traders and the Victorian protectionists, and between the more and less populous states. Labor had formed in the colonies, but it played little role in the debates about federation. The established politicians didn't expect Labor to have much impact on the new Commonwealth Parliament either. How wrong they were. The first federal election returned 16 Labor candidates to the House of Reps, and as neither the Conservative Free Traders nor the Liberal Protectionists won a majority, so Labor held the balance of power. This was a new and unanticipated line of division. Labor's share of the vote rapidly increased until 1910, when it became the first major party to hold majority government. And as Prime Minister, Deakin relied on Labor's support for much of his legislation. For those who were used to the more fiercely partisan politics that followed fusion and more disciplined party behaviour, Deakin's ambivalence about party has always been a blot on his reputation. But this is to judge him anachronistically. Deakin believed in a unified national interest, which grew out of the experiences of Australians and the particular challenges that they faced. He always said he put policy before party and the national interest before the strategic electoral interest. He would compromise his policy with his opponents, he'd compromise with his opponents to achieve his policy goals, as was regularly required of the leader of minority government. And he believed that this wasn't a sign of weakness, but of strength, and that the politics that resulted from compromise would be stronger for their reliance on a range of stakeholders. In 1940, when the country was at war, Menzies too was leading a minority government, dependent on the support of two independents. Twice, Menzies invited Labor to form a national government, and twice John Curtin replied that while cooperating with the government in the war, they would cooperate with the government in the war effort, but Labor wouldn't surrender its freedom of action. When Menzies calls Deakin the great constructor, he's making a judgment that the building of institutions and policies according to one's conception of the national interest is the key test of prime ministerial achievement, not partisan victories or the winning of elections. He doesn't call him the greatest fighter or the fiercest political warrior. Now, Menzies held power in very different political circumstances from Deakin, when Australian parties were more disciplined and the political arena more obviously partisan. Yet when he won an election, he would tell the electors that he didn't govern just for those who voted for him, but for all Australians. And when he said this, like Deakin, he was projecting the possibility of a unified national interest which the government would serve. Now, I know other Prime Ministers also sometimes say this, but not all of them live up to it as well as Menzies or Deakin. Menzies shared with Deakin a commitment to individual conscience and freedom of judgment. These commitments are the motive springs of liberalism, with their roots in the struggles against feudal and monarchic privilege and in the Protestant Reformation. But they need to be refreshed and rethought as political circumstances change. In the history of Australian liberalism, the rise of the Labor Party to a party of government and the consequent fusion of erstwhile competing parties was such a change. In Victoria before fusion, Labor's electoral success was largely at the expense of the middle-class Liberals who held the inner-city working-class seats and regarded themselves as friends of the workers. Labor wouldn't agree to electoral immunity for sitting members, despite frequent pleas from Deakin. George Reid saw the inevitability of the formation of a united non-Labor party earlier than Deakin, but in 1909, Deakin bowed to the inevitable to become leader of the new fused party. This was a traumatic decision for Deakin and for his Liberals to turn against those with whom they'd cooperated and join with those who had been their chief political enemy. So how could they justify it and explain it to themselves? The solution was to focus on Labor's disciplined organisation and especially on the pledge that was required of Labor candidates to support Labor policy and to vote in Parliament as the majority of caucus determined. At the launch of the Commonwealth Liberal Party in 1909, Deakin attacked Labor's disciplined party machine in which small committees made binding decisions outside the lights of day and which asked a voter and his representative to put aside the only thing which made him a man, his judgment and his conscience. This difference in organisational philosophy became a major line of demarcation between Labor and the First Liberal Party and its successors. Menzies, you'll remember, put it to devastating effect in the 1963 election when he attacked Labor's 36 faceless men. At the core of this difference in organisational philosophy is the different weight given to individual over collective action. Menzies also inherited from Deaconite liberalism a faith in the enabling state. Colonial states had built the physical infrastructure for settlement. In the 1890s, as old world poverty appeared in Australia, many Australian Liberals also embraced social liberalism. Social Liberals argued for a much broader conception of the state's responsibilities than classical laissez-faire Liberals, who wanted to limit the state's role to defence and the maintenance of law and order, and leave the market to determine wages and working conditions. Social Liberals, largely inspired by Christian humanitarianism, argued that the state should regulate working conditions and ameliorate poverty so that all its citizens could develop their God-given talents and potential to become full human beings. Now, debates about the role of the state in liberal democracies like Australia are always debates about balance. Balance between individual freedoms and the collective good, and balance between private enterprise and public provision. Deakin saw the state as an agent for progress, and he was optimistic about its capacities. This optimistic view of state action is, I think, also evident in Menzies. Opening the Albury Conference in 1944, he said that non-Labor had been put in a position of appearing to resist political and economic progress, and so was being branded reactionary. But he said, There was no room in Australia for a party of reaction. There is no useful place for a party of negation. We took the name Liberal, he later wrote, because we were determined to be a progressive party, willing to make experiments and in no sense reactionary. In rejecting a party of negatives, Menzies was echoing Deacon's famous rejection of George Reid as offering nothing but a necklace of negatives. And he was also positioning non-Labor as a progressive political force, open to new ideas and directions. After he won government in 1949, he embraced much of Labor's post-war nation-building agenda. And when I write the longer version of the paper, I'll fill out the ways in which I think you can see Menzies embracing an enabling state in many of the policies he carried into the 1950s. Now, I want to conclude with a slightly more speculative reflection on the probability that Menzies looked to Deakin as a role model for the well-lived liberal political life. Both men were Victorians, influenced by the liberal political culture of the Victorian goldfields. Both were sons of small businessmen. Deakin's father ran a coaching business that was later taken over by Cobb & Co. Both were educated at Melbourne private boys' schools. Both studied law at the University of Melbourne, though Menzies was a far more successful and distinguished lawyer than Deakin ever was. Both men were great readers and lovers of literature. Both also spent some time on the backbench after resigning from high office and used this time to renew their political commitments and take on foundational political work. Deakin spent time on the backbench during the 1890s and then threw himself into the cause of federation. Menzies into building a new non-Labor party. Both men were motivated by an ideal of service to the nation and returned to high office with their greatest political achievements still before them. The parallels are many, and they would have been obvious to Menzies. For him, I suggest Alfred Deakin would have been a seminal figure. Now, perhaps there's confirmation of my hunch in his library. I wasn't interested in Deakin when I was looking at the library in the late 1880s. And the only books of Deakin's that were available during Menzies' lifetime were 2 books on India, which he was unlikely to have owned. He is likely, however, to have owned and read Walter Murdoch's affectionate biography that was published in 1923. So when I get the chance, we'll go and have a look at to see if there's a copy on the shelves with underlining that prove my hunch, attesting to the admiration that that Menzies had for Deakin and his influence on his own political life. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. That's absolutely fascinating, and I think really giving people pause for thought about some of the traditional hypotheses we have about Menzies and Deakin. You talked about the similarities between Deakin and Menzies' beliefs, but could you unpack a bit the contrasts? What were the starkest contrasts between their outlooks?
Well, I think the starkest contrast is the political circumstances in which they're living, really. I mean, the Deakin goes into politics, becomes a member of Parliament in 1879, 1880, and political parties, as we understand them, as they come to take shape in the 20th century, hadn't formed in the way they had, and I think that's the biggest difference. Deakin goes into a parliament where political allegiances are fluid, where ministries are put together around leaders, where members of parliament pride themselves on their independence and see themselves essentially there to get benefits for their constituents. Much more parish pump politics. I know we still have quite a lot of that, but there was a lot more of it. And so Deakin is dragged in, the Labor Party essentially forces the other political side to mimic it and to form a similar organisation with disciplined votes in the Parliament. So I see that as being the biggest difference.
Will, okay. here and then.
Do I have to press anything? Okay. Thank you for that presentation. My name's Lucas McLennan. My question just is, I know he perhaps passed away before the movement to sort of change the Australian settlement took place in the late 1970s and 80s. But there were writers and thinkers who were challenging protectionism, arbitration and other aspects of that settlement in the 60s and 70s. Did Menzies express any viewpoints about that you're aware of, that he was either concerned about that or defensive of the old system, in those last decades of his life?
On that, Menzies, is a supporter of protection. I mean, his government increased protection, particularly under Jack McEwen. He was not a supporter of a rapid dismantling of white Australia. And just another correction of the record, Troy mentioned the interviews with Francis McNichol, which I actually listened to when I was doing my research. And there's some, I mean, I didn't use it. There's some pretty terrible stuff in there about Aborigines, which I took as being, he's old and you can't hold the ramblings of an old man against him, I don't think, for all of what his life was. But he was not a supporter of the dismantling of white Australia. It doesn't support, I mean, he supports the existence of trade unions. He's not, he grows and governs within the Australian settlement.
Thanks, Judith. Will Stoltz, ANU. And can I just, before I ask my question, I think another contrast between Menzies and Deakin might be that Menzies participated in far less seances than Deakin. I'm not sure you might have a different view on that.
He wasn't a spiritualist.
Yeah. I'm interested, you see this kind of modern phenomenon with contemporary liberals often kind of harking back to the kind of myth and legacy of Menzies in contextualising contemporary politics. Was that something that Menzies decided to use in his campaign tactics when he established the Liberal Party to hark back to Deakin, or was that not really in the public memory?
He doesn't talk much about Deakin. I mean, he uses the same name for the party, but he's very much concerned, and I think David brought that out, that the United Australia Party had collapsed and it was pretty discredited. So he's really wanting to make clear that this is a new beginning. He doesn't want to say too much about the Nationalist Party or the United Australia Party because, as I said, they're both pretty discredited at that point. Labor's in government, leading the war. It's very popular. So he needs to make a clean break in that sense. That doesn't mean in his own thinking he's not looking back to other models, but he's not, and also, like, the other thing that he's doing, the Labor Party establishes a clear national model, whereas what you had with non-Labor at that point was you've got different parties in the different states which hark back to the different colonial histories. And so they come together at the federal level, but in terms of fighting a united election, there's not a proper federal secretariat. Organisationally, it's a mess. So he also needs to build a new organisation that's capable of fighting, a national election and winning.
Yes, thank you for that very interesting presentation. Your answer to Georgina's question, William Coleman, of the ANU. Your answer to Georgina's question was essentially Menzies was Deakin in different circumstances. That's the way I took it anyway. And I'm sure you wouldn't mean that quite literally, but I wonder if there is something in driving the differences between them a bit more. Religion. I mean...
Yeah, well, look, okay then. Deakin is a much more introspective person than Menzies. He's not... he's also, I think, more charming. He's better looking. I think. He's a 19th century romantic in many ways, Deakin.
He had very intense artistic aspirations.
Well, he wanted to be a writer and a poet. But I mean, what I find interesting, both the men wrote poetry, but in looking at most, I've found many in the papers of many pre-war politicians, you find poetry. I mean, writing poetry was verse was something that you did at school, and they knew how to do it. But yeah, I mean, Deacon is probably has more inner doubts, I think, than Menzies. I think he's a more troubled figure politically. I mean, a more troubled man, I would say. He keeps a prayer diary from 1884 to 1913, all through his time in power, and he doesn't write in it every day, but he uses that, I think, as a point of a sort of a still point in his day, to try to recenter himself and reflect on his sense of purpose. He's more, he goes through periods of doubt about whether politics is really where his destiny is or what his vocation is. In a way, I don't think Menzies did. I think Menzies is in some ways a more worldly man than Deacon was.
And yet, Menzies was conventionally religious. I don't just mean perfunctorily religious. He was the son of a Methodist preacher, and he kept to conventional Protestantism. While Deacon was just way out there, wasn't he? I mean, that surely is a big difference between...
Well, way out there's a bit... That doesn't tell us very much, really. Deacon is probably a theist. I mean, he believes in a divine universe. He believes in God, but he is not... the only congregation that he is ever very involved in is... oh, God, I'm just getting old. Charles Strong's Australian Church, but I doubt that Menzies prayed every night. I mean, Menzies doesn't keep a prayer diary and Deacon does, so it's a bit silly to say that his religion is way out there. He's praying to a Christian God. There's not much of the New Testament. There's a bit of the New Testament in him in the 1890s when he's under the influence of Strong. He reads the Bible regularly, and he's interested in comparative religion. So because of the belief in the divine universe, he sees other religions as approaching divinity through a different path. But there's a religious tolerance there, which, I mean, I think is there in Menzies too, but I don't think Menzies has the interest in comparative religion that Deacon had.
Well, the question is, were they equally Christian? And the answer is surely not.
I don't know whether Christian is the right way of putting it. You know, it's not the only way of being religious.
Might go to Jeff. Is that for a final question?
Hi, Jeff.
Yeah.
Yes, Jeff Robertson from Deakin University. Yeah, that was very interesting, Judith. I was just thinking in a sense that both Deacon and Menzies are anti-socialists, and that's important to them to oppose the threat of socialism. But would you say that being anti-socialist for them doesn't mean opposing
Which
the idea?
socialist? Sorry?
They're both anti-socialist.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, and that's important for them. But that goes with supporting quite potentially a large enabling state.
Yes.
And that's the way in which is perhaps difficult to grasp now, but you can be anti-socialist and support a fairly large enabling state. And even Reid can't stand Bruce Smith and the sort of libertarian end at the free traders either. So that sort of came to my mind, that they're anti-socialist and that's important, but that goes with liberalism as well.
Yeah, well, I think that was the point I was trying to make about balance. I mean, Reid, brings in a conciliation and arbitration courts into New South Wales to deal with the strikes and the bitterness of the early 90s. It's a matter of how much of this, how much the state, what's the balance between state and private enterprise? How much does government do? How much do we leave to private enterprise? And it's a matter of balance. So they're not against the state doing things. And I think you're right that in the current climate. The other thing is that Deacon is writing and thinking before the emergence of, before the Soviet Union, and so it's a different context, whereas for Menzies, the battle against socialism has a different urgency because it's also linked into the power politics of the international world, because there's now communist states where we can see what the impact on human liberty and human lives are in those communist states. So I think there's a greater urgency for Menzies than there was for Deakin because of the very different political circumstances they're facing.